This Tibet House video was originally recorded at Menla Retreat in Phoenicia, New York, March 2017. To learn more about this annual program, please visit menla.us.
I went there twice. Was it twice or three times? Twice. I think I went there twice. And it's an amazing place, very high, about 18,000, 19,000 feet. And if you go there and make a prayer to the goddess, then you can see the future. And that's where they go to discover the reincarnations of the Dalai Lama. And then one of the times I was there happened to be the time the Chinese were coming with the Lama from Tashilumbo to find the Palden Lhamo. And the Secret Service, Chinese Secret Service people with that Lama were very annoyed to see a Western group there in tents, but they couldn't kick us out. And the Lama sneaked over in the pre-dawn moments and scratched on my tent and sneaked into my tent and sent me messages to Dalai Lama about the Palden Lhamo. How he would keep the Dalai Lama in the loop, and how he wouldn't tell the Chinese, this and that, and he was making all kinds of, and then he sneaked out before the dawn. I was surprised. I didn't know that. I mean, it wasn't planned. It just happened by accident. And people see visions. She showed the vision that by which they recognized the Dalai Lama. So the Buddhists, the thing is, the Buddhists are a little bit complacent, because they do feel this connection with the Great Mother. If you feel a connection with the Great Mother, it's really hard. It's hard to imagine, but we Westerners are definitely brought up that life is bad, and that we have to be guarded against life, because for thousands of years the Church was sending everybody to hell, about whatever natural feelings they had. There's something sinful and horrible about them. And then the materialists simply intervened and said, you don't have to worry about it because you're going to be nothing, because you don't have a soul and you don't have a mind. And so people desperately cling to that. Like my grandfather, I started doing Buddhism when he was around 90. And he was a hardcore materialist. And he started debating me when I discovered when I was intuitively felt that there was a continuity of lives, and it began to become sort of commonsensical to me. I think it takes 10 decades or two to really shift the conditioning that we have about how we expect this life to be the only thing that is us. This body, we're the body. So it's very, very hard for us and this body, there's lots of germs internally, there's like hazards externally, there's terrorists, there's robbers, murderers, muggers, what have you, abusive relatives, there's all these terrible things. So to sort of turn that around and decide that we're floating in the Great Mother, nirvana, that everything is just fine, and any suffering and any problem has to do with our maladjustment. The mental maladjustment to ignorance and to delusively clinging to some worldview that isn't really the case. And physical maladjustment, or other ways, based on that core wiring thing of the maladjustment of thinking that we're something more important than the rest of it. And the rest of it is kind of against us. And that's what our culture has indoctrinated us in. And at very powerful levels, even we think we have a belief in some other thing, we're still kind of geared that way, frightened of everything. That is the thing. And, somehow, I think India puzzled people when the Westerners started discovering India culturally. And of course China also to a lesser extent, but India and other Asian countries. But all those countries that had been strongly touched by Buddhism, which is not a religion, not only as a religion, let's say, but as a different worldview, a different science, a different reality view. people were less violent, more gentle, they were less mobilized. The Muslims who had conquered India centuries before the Europeans arrived had become less militant by living there, by being indoctrinated or sort of acculturated with the Indian abundance and the Indian kind of relaxed, inner energy, openness to energy. And they were making Taj Mahals and things, etc. And leaving there. When they arrived, they were not caring so much about their women, but they learned to in India, or they kept their thing. So, I long for the day when history is taught in such a way that the victors in the great colonial conquest of the planet are seen as the less civilized, and the people who were conquered are seen as the more civilized. Civilized, otherwise, the Brits thought civilized meant, stiff upper lip and shoot people who don't pay taxes to you, put them in debt or prison, or whatever. Genocide them. And that's the lesser people who behave like that, I think. So one of the main things, I think, one of the main jobs at Menla that we feel is of the mission at Menla, because it's kind of trying to be a little outpost of Tibetan culture. Tibet is an extraordinary country that had a huge conquest empire 1,400 years ago. The Chinese were scared of them, the Nepalis were scared of them, the Muslims who were scared of them. They defeated Harun al-Rashid's armies in western Tibet and in northern Pakistan, that area. They were very ferocious and rough, coming from that tremendous high altitude with that nitric oxide chemistry that they have. The Tibetan body has extreme durability, strength. And in about 1,000 years, they officially more or less demilitarized, where there was no budget for military, more or less, and it was not considered a good occupation, and that kind of a sort of ambitious male person, and the females were not doing military in those days much, but very rarely, but the ambitious male who normally would have made their rise in society through becoming some kind of warrior, they became monks. And they developed this peace culture, basically. Even though there was some rough stuff in it, and some of the monks were rough, actually. Too rough, But they had the Tuffy, what I call the Tuffy monks, the Doptos. But still, it's an extraordinary civilization achievement over that period of many centuries to change the culture from where you don't really admire the violent warrior anymore. And you admire the self-controlled person seeking self-control, self-transcendence, self-conquest rather than other conquest. And I think the Indians, it's less clear because of the waves of people who invaded India, but I think large parts of India also achieved that before they were conquered by the Muslim invasions. And then the Mongolians sort of imitated the Tibetan one, and the Tibetans sort of foisted that same cultural shift on them in a quicker time, about 400 or 500 years, from the ferocious Mongolian Empire to a non-violent, demilitarized society that was easily beaten up by Russians and Chinese in the 20th century, because it didn't really have a war culture. So it's really, we're taught in our schools, for example, that every culture and country has always fought. And if you were demilitarized or if you were let your defenses down, you'd be invaded and taken over by a neighbor. Everyone was taught that. And in a way, the Buddhist countries, the ones that were really heavily Buddhist, not just sort of partially Buddhist, but really when mainstream Buddhist, which were really India, Tibet, and Mongolia, were really the only three. The East Asian countries always maintained a big role, and the Southeast Asian countries, for the king and the army. They never really completely demilitarized, so Buddhism there was like countercultural, like Christianity was in the Western countries, because the military remains the main thing still. The biggest, strongest institution, the kingship and the military in the country. And In India, in Buddha's time, it was like a kingship and military. And he created a new model for that. You know. And actually modern, like Sri Aurobindo, some of modern Indian mystics and great spiritual leaders who also knew something about history and also were part of the wish to be liberated from the British colonial thing and so on. But they blamed the Buddhists for creating this too much asceticism and making their country militarily weak over many centuries to then be conquered by first Muslims and then Europeans. And Aurobindo, Buddha is not popular in Oroville, as I found. There are a lot of people there who are like, oh no, the Buddhists were too much asceticism, too pacific, then we got conquered by the Europeans. And the Neo-Confucians feel that, actually, in China, to a certain extent, you know. Because Buddhism puts into question the sort of native thing, actually, always. It's, I like to say, the Buddhist monastery is the first domestic abuse intervening institution in history. Especially the female monasticism, which Buddha was reluctant to do because he knew it would stress out the tolerance of the male authorities in the society, because there would be such a rush by the women to get out of the extended male patriarchal family system, which it was. You know, they weren't really dying to have babies starting at 12, you know, and maybe 10, 12 childbirths, half of them surviving by 20 or 25, and being pretty wrecked by that. You know, that was the female role, you know, and besides work and cook and plant and weed and harvest and whatever. And so but he did create the female monasticism, and there was a huge rush, as he predicted there would be, and the Brahmins didn't tolerate it for too many centuries, because, you know, they wanted to marry off their daughters, their women were their slaves. They didn't want them off there becoming enlightened and begging lunch instead of having to cook it. So I just wanted to make that point. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to digress too much into history, but I want to make the point that, you know, the more you can slowly shift your reality sense and decide that whatever happens, the more open you are, whatever, live or die, everything is fine. You know, the more closed you are, the more stressed, the more difficult, the more harm, the more struggle it will be. And it's very hard to shift that around. And we definitely, you know, train to be guarded and defended. You know. And of course, practically, there's some degree of guarding and defending, naturally. Nobody's saying go out and step in front of a tank or something right away. But that the rule of thumb is like that. That the underlying thing, if all else fails, and you have to go, then it'll be all right if you can just give it up, you know. As they say, give it up. That's really hard to make that shift. But that's a really key thing to do. You know, my slogan in the Why the Dalai Lama Matters book, I was challenged by a wonderful publisher, Simon & Schuster, an Australian woman. I can't remember her name, but she said, okay, at the end of this book, you have to write for me one appendix. I said, okay, sure, what is that? And I was ready to do anything because she overruled various people who were worried, editors, and she put the red flag on the cover. You know, Simon & Schuster editor.
Oh, Losada.
The publisher, the top boss. You know. And so I was ready, and she said, you have to write down 10 points of hope. You know, about the Tibet-China thing and about the world or something like that. So I did that. There's a little appendix you can see in that book. But the last statement in the book is, so our duty in fighting against the bad guys and the blue meanies, as the Beatles called them, is to be happy. And the challenge is to be so happy that even if they kill us, we'll die happy. And I love that line, I don't know why. I then used it a lot in my talks. Because sometimes, especially during certain kinds of time when people were thinking this and that was going wrong and there was terrorism and whatever it is, since our country was hijacked 15 years ago, 16, 17 years ago, by the military-industrial complex, then I like that line because when I generally give a hopeful, upbeat, sort of Dalai Lama-esque vision of the world, sometimes people feel inspired and they want to make a standing ovation, which I find a little embarrassing and awkward. So when I use that line, they start to jump up. Even if they kill us, we'll die happy. They go like, oh, you kind of calm them down. And they like relax a little bit. So I'm happy with that. I enjoy that one. I mean, not that I'm capable of succumbing so easily myself, whatever happens. I don't pretend to be, reach that point, really. But I can see the principle, that's what I'm trying to convey. So that what I'm trying to share with you is that you should try to imagine that you're experimenting, you're in a life of learning, and the aim of your life is to learn how to be happier, and it's in a background of a situation that at its fundamental level is happiness. Somehow you are made of happiness. You're made of relief, you're made of bliss, you're made of health. That's what you're made of. And any feeling that you have that you don't have that is something you can unravel internally in yourself, ultimately. Either in this life or another life, And so everything's going for you, so to speak. Like health itself, for example. I think that, I think the health, your one cell and one molecule or one whatever it is in your body likes the next one. So it's sort of ready to be open to connecting, like the different cells and molecules in the fingers and the thumb, they're in the hand, that's ready to connect to the other one. So they enjoy being connected to each other. So that openness and the cheerfulness and openness of the substances even that our body is made of is our health. And when we put into it an attitude that there's something wrong with us, it's like when Deepak Chopra has one of the things where he says they did some studies, and when people go in to have like a HIV thing, when they hear that they have it, even whether it's true or not, even if it was a mistake or for some reason in part of the study I think they were doing, their T cell count drops instantly by a huge percentage. Just thinking that they're like ill, So the mind is so powerful in that. So anyway, so that's the thing. That's our job. Try to figure out that everything is okay.
And one of the really good, one of the helpful ways to do that is to align with.
Yes. That's a great mother, of course.
Right.
It's like that C.K., Louis C.K., the comedian. Did you ever see his little thing before the election?
No.
If only it had been done like 6 months earlier and was everywhere and everybody. He gave this thing about how he finally realized he was going to definitely vote for Hillary and everyone should. It was on one of those late night talk shows, I forget which one. And he said, why, he said, because Hillary is a mom. And moms, they know how to take abuse. And after all, that's what you want a president is for. You want to complain it's the president's fault, and it's like it's really horrible, and the president's terrible. That she's used to one thing Hillary Clinton has learned to do is to take abuse. He went on and on with that. And he said the other one, you say a tiny little criticism of him, everything stops until he can go and get you. And besides, he said, even a good dad, he said, is still only 40% of what a good mom is. And he went on and on with it in a way. And his final punchline was, if you vote for Hillary, you're smart. If you vote for Trump, you're being conned, or you're a fool or something. You're going to be deceived. And if you don't vote at all, you're an asshole. They gave these three things, but it was really brilliant. It was about 4 or 5 minutes. And it's worth looking up on YouTube. Louis C.K. on one of those shows, like the late night ones, you know. Maybe it was the one who used to be, what's his name? Conan. I think it was Conan. And Conan was helping him on, and leading him on, you know, very nicely. Really good. Sorry. But he said about, so the idea that the Western thing is like the supreme power is a male god, is a dad, you see, not a mom. Right? So the shift, the idea that the supreme power, the reality is a mom, is really more relaxing, actually.
Well, for some people.
What?
For some.
Well, for everybody but the mom.
Yeah.
But apparently that mom is able to take it. Apparently. Great mom.
So Bob, we had a question over here earlier.
Yes? What?
Thank you for sharing the story about Lama. It's funny that you mentioned visiting the lake, because my question is about Palden Lhamo.
Yeah, Palden Lhamo?
Yes, we were going to talk about Tara, and then I thought of her because I'm always confused by the story, because she's very ferocious and she has her baby's skulls sitting. She's sitting with the children
in her mouth.
And the blood, and you know, she's very ferocious. So I wondered if you could explain that goddess.
Well, you know her story. You know her story. What it was?
Sure,
her origin story
of
Sri Devi, at least from the Buddhist side.
Yes.
The origin story is that she, as an incarnation of Tara, was the favorite queen of a South Indian king, who was unspecified, it's like a legend, but who engaged in human sacrifice. And he was a warrior king, and when he would conquer a neighboring king, then he would sacrifice prisoners. It was one of his things. And at some point, some climactic point, she was given the honor of leading out some sacrificial victims as the head queen, the chief queen. And so what she did was she came out holding her two children by this king in her two hands, you know, a boy and a girl. And he said, "What's the matter with you? Are you insane? But those are my children." And she said, "Well, all of the beings that you sacrifice are your children. So you wanted me to bring out captives, so here, you sacrifice them." And then he said, at first he was angry and like, no, you know, arrest this woman. You know, he was going to like do her in, of course, as beautiful and as desirable as she was. And then, but then when they tried to sort of stop her, the police or the soldiers, whoever, you know, bodyguards, she turned into Kali, Sri Devi, and she herself sacrificed the two children right in front of them, tore them to bits, and Twala put one of them in her mouth, and one of them, I think, she made a saddle thing on this mule, skin of one of them, and he had to watch this because he, you know, had a divine thing. And then he was like, "Okay, I'll stop. I'll never do it. Turn back into yourself. I get the message." You know? But she was too late, and she rode off into the sky. And so it's a story like that. So in a way, it's interesting. It's like one way men have abused women in history is by threatening the children of the mother, and that they'll do something to the children. You know, if the women don't do what they want. So that's the weakness of the woman, is her attachment to the children. So she precisely, you know, she shows that she's not going to be deterred by that. And the idea as a divinity, of course, is that she created these children, but they are just her product. Like, it's a common Indian theme. It might sound shocking to you, but it's a common Indian theme. For example, there's a wonderful former life story of the Buddha's, where he was a great sage in a certain kingdom. And there were 6 teachers who were agitating, didn't like him because he gave good advice to the king, and the country was prosperous and it was fine. And there were 6 ministers who had other ideologies, and they wanted to get rid of him politically, and they badmouthed him. And eventually the king kind of suspected him, and he left, you know, the kingdom. And then those ministers gave advice, and the kingdom was going down the drain, you know. So then the guy returned, this Mahabodhi, his name was, this sage. He felt sorry for the people of the kingdom and the king, who had been a friend of his. So he created a magic monkey himself, and then he killed it and skinned it. But he had created it anyway. It was his magic. It was his own magical action. And then he went back wearing the skin of the monkey, the fresh skin of the monkey. And then the 6 ministers, when he came to the court, and he was welcomed at the court, he's visiting, the great old guy who's my friend. And then the ministers were frightened to see him because they thought he might return into the good graces of the king. So they started attacking him for having killed the monkey, having come with the dead monkey skin. And then he refuted them one and all. One of them was a fatalist, one was a nihilist, they were different kinds of ideologies. But he proved how all of their ideologies would make it where they wouldn't care at all about killing a monkey. And then he revived the monkey. And he said, this was just my creation, and I just created this as a show to draw you guys out and to show you, because my nature of thing, compassion, wisdom, the Dharma teaching is you just wouldn't kill a monkey to do this, In fact, I do care about it for this being the reason that that monkey and me are one being. In other words, the teaching like we've been talking, wisdom and compassion. So the fact that she killed those 2 children in front of him, which was the people that he did identify with and didn't want to sacrifice, but then she did that to let him see what it felt like, then cured him apparently. He needed that tough medicine to stop human sacrifice. That's the origin story of that version of Kali, who was the special protector of Dalai Lama. And when he came out as a refugee, escaping the Chinese in 1959, the Chinese mousetrap that had been set for him and the Tibetan, he had a thing on his back that looked like maybe a gun, because he was dressed as a soldier, but actually it was the rolled up special tanka he has of Palden Lhamo, which only the Dalai Lamas can see. Nobody else sees it. Apparently she talks and gives advice and does different things. It's very active. I have a novel that I co-wrote with someone that we have to finish one of these days, of the 6th Dalai Lama, and the tanka is very much an acts. Sometimes talks and gets shakes,
Good.
It intervenes in the painting, the icon of Palden Lhamo. So she's really great. She has a mild form where she's like a wealth goddess, like Lakshmi, very mild and beautiful and holding jewels and vases and things like that. But she can adopt that other form to get rid of bad guys. Palden Lhamo. Another question? Any question? Yes. Erica.
Thank you. I was okay. I was wondering if you could offer sort of your interpretation from, Shantideva, sort of like offering the victory.
Offering what?
Offering the victory.
Oh, the victory. Oh, yeah. You mean like what they call lojong in Tibet, mind transformation. Yeah, Shantideva is that one. That's in the patience chapter for Shantideva. But the lojong grows out of that, out of Nagarjuna and Shantideva's thing. But lojong is a little more radical, almost the same thing actually. And there the idea is again surprising. Again, it relates to what I was rambling on about at the beginning, actually. Where if you feel that the base reality is goodness, pure satisfaction, nirvana, which Buddha renounced immediately. 4 Noble Truths means, of the 4 Noble Truths, only one of them is actual reality. 3 of them are superficial reality. They are kind of actual, but they're illusory. They're not a complete illusion, but they're illusory. So that means the cause of suffering and the cause of suffering, and the path to the freedom from suffering, 1st, 2nd, and 4th, are superficial reality. The only ultimate reality, real reality, is nirvana, the 3rd Noble Truth, that there's freedom from suffering. So Buddha did announce that. He never taught really a dualistic idea that there's an escape zone outside the world where you can go and be free of suffering. But he let them think there would be something like that to some extent, because some hard case people who were very alienated and are very invested in their sort of inner space that's separate from everything else. The inner absolute, it's them. You know, the idea that that inner absolute will be fully realized in an experience of nirvana or vast space or whatever different images, or oneness with the deity, with an absolute deity that is disconnected from the world, you know. As mystics get into that. They're not going to, so let them think that they're achieving that in order to become more peaceful and better in the world. And then ultimately, of course, they discover that it doesn't last and there is no such place. The absolute cannot be a place that is not the relative, or it's a relative. Right? Because there's a boundary between it and the relative. So there's no such thing in that sense. That's what emptiness means. The absolute is emptiness, which means the nature of the relative, the place where the relative happens, if you follow. It's that radical non-duality. So, so then if you know that, and you know it even just intellectually, it makes more sense to you, conceptually in other words. And viscerally you still don't really feel that, because of course viscerally you're still too scared to really be just completely open, just let it all go, just float downstream, whatever it is. And because you feel like you'll get hurt, you know, something will damage you, you know, the world is threatening and difficult, you know. And so, but if you have some level of grasping of that, even if it goes against maybe your habitual inclination of self-centeredness, which is a wiring thing, it isn't like some moralistic self-centeredness, it's just that's the way you see things. We see things, we see things like that, we're at the center of it. And then, however, I know that I'm wrong to be thinking that. So then when someone wants to make a conflict with me, and I'm about to go ballistic, and give myself over so that my body and mind complex becomes a tool of rage, anger, hostility, aggression, harmfulness, violence. Then that knowledge, you know, that the world is fine if you're open and you're not closing yourself. And the biggest closing and putting a boundary between self and other is when you give yourself over to hate. You're taken over by hate, fury, anger, all those emotions. Then you have a motive to restrain that anger, to not let it arise, to diffuse it in some other way. And that's why then when the enemy comes at you, you say, okay, you win. You can, you know, rather than fight you, rather than you yourself are a helpless person driven by your own jealousy and anger and hatred, etc. Those addictions, addictive mental addictions that force you to close yourself off and be harmful to others, and now you want to be harmful to me. But one thing is that that's your real enemy. You're not really my enemy, you're just a tool of this. And the enemy is that hatred and those addictive mental states. Those are my real enemy. And so the one thing, I will die before I will allow that real enemy to take me over and make me a counter tool, so to speak, and then we'll just be destroying each other. Or somebody will win or not win, but and then the one who wins, the one who doesn't win will die, but will die in an angry way and wanting to be more powerful in the next life and more violent in the next life, and the one who wins will be more paranoid that other people are going to get him or her or it, and then they diminish the quality of their life and they become more isolated and more shut off from others and more alienated and more paranoid and more aggressive a bit because they become more habituated to it. So that's the what's called the lojong, the mind transformation. And again, it's at a background where you have shifted your reality sense. Your reality sense is, I'm not here to defend this meat. This, in a way, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, my friend John Perry-Brala, he, crazy guy, and it's fun. He calls, those guys are into virtual reality, they call this meat space. What? You're in meat space. And then when you're in virtual reality, you're in mind space, you're in like the electronic, you're like Matrix. This is before the Matrix, they had this thing. So in a way, the person who is letting the other have the victory and so on, At the deepest level is where someone really viscerally has begun to know that, and to them, life and death are just, death is just a way you improve the quality of life. You just get to let go of one coarse body and you get a better one. And you know how to do that, and you're confident you're going to do that, and because you're not going to be driven by anger, hatred, lust, envy, fear, are going to be driven into some hole, in some bad state, because you're able to detach from those energies. They can't take you over, and you can even use them at a higher stage, but you can't pretend to use them if actually they do take you over, which the ordinary person they do. And there are points where they just can't not do it, whatever it is. And so that's the background. You see, that background thing I was talking about is the key thing. That's the Great Mother thing. So mindful that this is the Great Mother. That is really important. It's like this wonderful verse that I always love to recite from the King of Samadhi Sutra, Samadhi Raja Sutra, which says, who understands causality, cause and effect, which means relativity in a way. That person will definitely understand emptiness. And who understands emptiness, that person will become mindful of the most minute workings of things. So, instead of like when you understand the absolute or emptiness, the dualistic idea of the absolute, when you understand the absolute, like forget about it, it's just an illusion, who needs it? I don't have to worry about anything, I'm just in some vast other place. But actually, when you realize emptiness, you realize that everything is the relativity, and then within the relativity, a little better versus a little worse is a huge deal. And of course, a big better versus a big worse is also a huge deal. So then, in a situation of struggle and conflict, when you really are capable of the mind transformation, you're basically what is called a saint. In Western ethical thinking, they call it ultra-obligatory ethics. Ethics of virtue, which is ultra-obligatory. In other words, you're able to erase yourself in a situation. You're totally able to. And then you have achieved what is called, you have the transcendence of patience, or tolerance. I never can decide which word is better today nowadays. In the old days, the word patience for the quote-unquote moralists, among the deadly sins and things, as a virtue, patience was the word. But nowadays, I'm afraid patience somehow means that you're waiting to get your enemy later, rather than you're ready to bear whatever suffering without reaction.
So you think patience is a goal.
How which we more think of as tolerance. You tolerate, you have a high tolerance for whatever it is. Now there is a further thing though, and that is that, so that's when you're practicing something for yourself to develop your tolerance and patience and your ability to let the enemy have the victory. But once you're able to do that, then there's a question of judgment and responsibility in the situation. And if someone like is coming to kill you, and you would be able to let them do it rather than be angry with them. So not even killing you will not make you, or torturing you will not make you angry with them. It might make you really in pain. They're pulling your teeth or something. But it's not going to, you're still going to feel there to some helpless poor tool of some crazy idea that they're getting something by torturing you. So you were beyond that, reaction. But then it's very bad for another person to torture you. It's very bad for another person to kill you. So then you might actually evade the killing, you might stop them from killing, and in extreme case, you might, if you had to, someone who was about to press a button and kill, like the insane leader of North Korea, and kill everybody in Seoul by some bombs that his agents have planted there, that he doesn't need a missile to carry there, and he's just going to blow up the capital in a nuclear attack because somebody doesn't like his hairdo, because they're going to actually bomb his nuclear Yongbyon reactor, which they should have done 30 years ago, actually. Somebody should have blown that up. But save the poor North Korean people the misery that they've had all this time. But and you can only stop that person by shooting them. You can't just bind their hands and take them out for, re-education. But you have to even take their life. You do that. You should do that at that time if you're at that stage. You know, where then you're really caring for the other person, and it's not good for the enemy to harm you. But that's it. And then my son hates it when I even mention that, because he thinks that people will then pretend to themselves, "Well, I'm fine, but I'm gonna hit back anyway. You know, I'm not really mad, but it hurts me more than it hurts you." You know, it's a slippery slope sort of thing. He doesn't like it when but Buddhism is practical like that. And in particular, there's one particular thing, which is in relation to women who are always abused. You know, since we're here in the spirit of the Great Mother, you know, they, in a way, need to be more aggressive without anger. That's the trick. So they think that if they don't use it, they need their anger to be aggressive, they think. But actually, when you're aggressive, fueled by anger, short of you're enlightened, you're not necessarily enlightened, then your aggression will be less effective. Because there's all these studies, and the Buddhists, long before the studies, they know when you're angry, your judgment is impaired, and you're not strategic, and you maybe overdo, or you know whatever, and you bring down more wrath upon yourself often, you know, and you miss your shot, you know, whatever it is, you know, when you lose it, you're much less effective. So the key there is that to intervene in situations that are going wrong. That's the Shantideva teaching. When you see something happening that you don't think should happen, when something that you think should happen is prevented from happening, those are the two things that make you feel frustrated. Then if you internalize and nurse the frustration until it builds up, you then blow up and freak out. He analyzes it like that. So then he says the fuel of the anger, which is the fury, the hatred, the whatever, which is the real enemy, is that slowly increasing ball of frustration by things going wrong. He says, so therefore, do something about the situation before you get frustrated. If in case you can't do anything about it, your judgment tells you there's nothing you can do about it, it's going to happen, then don't get frustrated on top of that, on top of your helplessness, in other words. So he has this wonderful thing where if you can do something, why get frustrated? Why be unhappy? If you can't do anything, why be unhappy? Either way, don't be unhappy. That's the key. You know? And then if possible, intervene right away. And like women know that, you know they do. They are trained, socialized not to react aggressively, and to accept, you know, things that are on the borderline of abusive from their brothers, from their fathers, from male peers in schools and things. And they're socialized not to react in sort of knee-jerk quickly. And so they internalize this abuse and then get pushed around even more. So they think when they hear this thing about to give the victory to the other, what you're giving the victory to the...
I'm going to pee, if you must know.
So they need to learn not to blow up. So then they'll be told, well, you need anger to do it. But actually, if they intervene vigorously in situations before they get angry, when they're in a good humor, they'll be so much more effective, and they will forestall the thing, and that's the secret. That actually is the key. And then, of course, if you can't do anything about it, then of course you don't try to intervene. It's like the Buddhist theory of defense, which for years I thought there was no such thing. I used to tell people in dialogue, interreligious, you know, academic dialogues and other kinds of dialogues, that the Buddhists didn't even have a theory of a just war or just defense, but they do actually. And the just defense is if you can defend yourself effectively without necessarily destroying the aggressor, but just push them back to where they can aggress on you, and then you kind of make a deal with them, then not to try again without over-aggressing on them, then you should defend yourself. I mean, I'm talking like a king in a country, you know, or a leader in a country. If you cannot defend yourself, they are really much too powerful, then you should surrender right away. Because by fighting somewhat, like last-ditch sort of thing, you're going to kill some of them, and then they're going to be much more violent in their domination. And so they're pragmatic like that. So that's it. So that's the Shantideva teaching adapted. In my Inner Revolution, my Infinite Life book, I address this in great detail. It's like a commentary to Shantideva. Because, or normally when people teach Shantideva to Westerners, or moderners, you could even say not necessarily Westerners, but let's call them moderners, then since moderners don't think that they are anything other than their body and mind complex in this life, they don't really think they're something beyond death at a visceral level. Then Shantideva's thing about I'd rather die than get filled with hate makes no sense to them. Because what are you going to do when you die? You're just going to just eradicate yourself? The idea that the dying is a transformation into something else, and free of hatred and free of addictive mentality, it's a chance for a quantum leap, evolutionarily speaking. Is something that's just too remote. So I addressed that in that book, very, very intensely. Infinite Life.
Yes, thank you.
And I don't know if any of you have looked at that book, but you might enjoy it. Actually, I should make someone told me who does PR that they can't understand why I never made an audio book. We have to make an audio book since the press didn't do that. That would be a good thing to do.
Yeah.
People could lie there, people who were sick could lie there.
What's that called?
People who were sick could lie there and hear it. It would give them something, would teach them something.
Yes.
People are sick.
Oh yeah, that's right,
They'll
yes.
be listening
Yes.
to you talking that
I was
way.
thinking, I was really sick last month, and all my theories were put to the test because I felt so off. Where's the mother? Where's the great mother? Where's the nirvana today? Like everything aching and coughing. Oh, terrible influenza. But you have to do that. You have to work on finding the point, because somehow grinning and bearing somehow is the source of recovery. The grinning part. Any other questions? We can do some names. There's all this beautification going on. Or what do you want to do? You can do something. Let's climb a shamanic tree. Oh, I know what I want to say. This connects, I think, a little bit to shamanism. Quantum world, 1926. The most materialistic reductionist scientists in Europe. Einstein was there, Niels Bohr, Heisenberg, all of the great quantum. And the lead quantum people said that they had reached a point where they could not find a particle, that they couldn't say what deep reality, that is actual reality, finally, was. That mathematical theory, that material observation, physical observation could not reach into past this certain level of magnification. And wave particle paradox, uncertainty principle, meaning that when you observe some super micro reaction, that your observation interferes with it, so the notion of there being an objective thing that you're measuring, that you're reading off of the objective thing, fails. So that's what they said. But then they said, then never mind, take heart, don't be discouraged. We can work at the level where we have particles to work with. And bracketing the idea of the deep reality we don't know. And we can work with the particle level in a probability, statistics, we can invent things, we have quantum computers, we can blow up the world, we can do all kinds of stuff. At a coarser level, but at the deepest level, on the idea of reductionism, that if you keep magnifying and magnifying and magnifying, you'll get down to the rock bottom, a place where you can sort of control reality by its primal base or something like that. And they said no to that. And then Einstein rebelled against that, and he led a lot of the quantum physicists into all these crazy things about, like multiple realities and all kind of things that are not empirically testable, and therefore actually are just theology, basically. And because his theism wouldn't let him let go of the idea that somehow God's mind and his mathematical mind connecting to God's mind could seize something that he could control, nature. He would control the Great Mother, let's say. I didn't want to acknowledge could have been an impredicable and inconceivable and miraculous and uncontrollable energy there that it was reality itself, but you couldn't say what it was. So they discovered that. Buddha discovered that 2,600 years earlier, and the Buddhist tradition has been built on that. And then in the Kala Chakra, there's this most interesting thing that I never saw, but since then I found it in a few other sources that I didn't recognize. But there's this idea that a Buddha body has no atoms. So, and that's not saying that it's just mind. But since people are used to saying, well, mind is this so subtle thing, where there's no physical element to it, it's not different from the physical, mental and material, then people tend to want to say, well, everything is mind. But actually at that level, it's stupid to say that, because mind is a concept that is supposed to be the opposite of matter. So if there's no matter, there wouldn't be mind. It's something that no word will capture, in other words. So it's non-dual, mind and matter are non-dual, but it's not particulate matter. It's matter that's more like a thought. It's like a wave. It's like pure energy without any particles. And therefore, from the basis of that being of having such a body and having an awareness from that thing, it's like what I said yesterday, where the elements and then the subtle sub-elemental realities of the moonlight, sunlight, dark light, and clear light, those four levels below that level, those are the levels where the Buddha's body emanates, and that's why Buddha and the Great Mother can do miracles. That's why they can master the elements, because they're inside the elements in a certain way. The elements are the coarse particulate level things, and they are actually goddesses from the point of view of the Great Mother or of the Tantra, the Buddha. So I think that the indigenous shaman, the true master shaman, whatever they would theoretically say about it, I think they can get into their own subtlety of mind, and that's from which they can do these things that are considered non-ordinary. I never say supernatural. I think it's the wrong word. It's a word conceding to the materialists. You can only say supernormal.
Or non-ordinary.
What?
Or non-ordinary.
Or non-ordinary.
Yeah.
But we should never say supernatural, because nature is, the deepest level of nature is this and then they have, queer action at a distance, like strange things in the, where some spin of some atom that's a million miles away from the other atom changes that one instantaneously, which should be against the normal law of causality and so on. But that's those spooky action at a distance. That's what they call it. If you go to a level where mind and matter are non-different and it's super subtle and there's no material, and actually you can build all the body with all the elements and everything out of that, then that's an encouragement that we can learn to be aware from our most subtle central super subtle awareness. And that's something really interesting. And Kala Chakra makes a big fuss about that. Unlike it's the most deepest kind of Buddhist science is related to the Kala Chakra, I think. Time and space.
I'm not sure what the format is supposed to be, or what
What's
the
that?
program is. I'm not sure what the format. Can you hear me?
What format?
Well, is there a format?
Of what?
Of this class this afternoon?
Oh, no, we're having kind of discussion.
Oh, okay,
Why?
okay. So I just write, because I don't know, because I haven't sat with you all before
I
here. So at any rate,
Sometimes we lecture, let's say, and sometimes Visa guides ceremony, sort of a meditation.
Okay.
At the moment, we're having discussion.
I have a random musing or item for discussion on the way up here. I hate microphones because I feel like I'm really loud and people can hear me anyway.
You need it though.
Oh, you need it. Okay. So at any rate, I'll just say, I'll close my eyes because I feel self-conscious. There's a lot about with men, in relation to women and as opposed to women, I'll say. A lot of talk about I don't want to sound balls, okay? and how men talk about how, well, you don't have balls, or, you know, women don't have balls, or the thing about women that's different from men is that they don't have balls. And I thought, well, women do have balls.
Sure.
They are up inside them. They're their ovaries,
Yeah.
and that's where the eggs are.
Yeah.
And so, and in some sense, I don't want to say they're better than, okay? I'm not going to say they're better.
I bet you do.
Maybe. Well, they're protected, right? They're up inside our
Yes.
body, because they must be, to be protected.
Yes, okay, so what
So
is
in
that?
order, whatever, to be the right temperature, to, you know,
Yes.
to
Got
be
it.
able to bring forth life in the way that we are uniquely able to. And men's are descended, and they descend during development inside the uterus, in utero. That's part of human development. And do we all, and I'm not a scientist, do we all start as women and perhaps with the addition of a different chromosome become men? But at any rate, if anyone wants to, you know, respond to that or comment on that in the science or in the mythology of, you know, women and their eggs and their ovaries as compared with balls. And I'm sorry that you weren't here, because I heard you just kind of make a random remark in passing in our conversation about men and their balls. So I was talking about women having balls in the form of ovaries. Okay, just putting that out there.
Do you know what my reaction?
Thanks.
I was like, you know the joke about why so many sperms it takes so many sperms to find an egg and fertilize it? Did you ever hear that?
No.
You don't know the reason?
No.
Well, that's because none of them want to ever stop to ask for directions.
Yeah.
You ever heard that?
No, I haven't.
Oh, you got that one.
You know, maybe the Mayan,
Thing.
you know, the Mayan game, you know, with the ball court, the ancient Mayan, you know,
What?
try and get the ball through the.
Like Michael Douglas.
I'm no world traveler, but I had the good fortune to go to Chichen Itza and
Oh, yeah.
and see the ball court, you know,
Yeah.
and wow, that's something like.
Oh, you mean like the place where they played high lie or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, you have to, like, it unbelievable, like, you have to get the ball through this unbelievable hoop and what?
Without using their hands.
Yeah, without using your hands, and talk about offering the victory. The person who wins gets executed.
Ooh.
Oh, really?
Yes,
Well, I don't
it's
trust
considered
them.
an honor.
I know that's the Spanish conquistador
Yes.
reconstruction of the native people. Always they're executing people, but I don't agree with that.
No,
I don't believe that.
this was their
The
own culture.
executors were the Spanish.
Really?
I think so. I'm not agreeing with that. I know some shamans of some of those people, and they don't agree to that depiction of their culture, that they were so execution happy or sacrifice happy. They don't agree with that. And I think they have a right, they have a reason. You know, always the case in colonial conquest, they try to make the conquered culture something horrible. And that gives them their propaganda reason why they can take up the white man's burden. You know? And, but I don't want to go into that in detail right now. But I have a thing about it. Just want to mention that. I don't believe all that stuff.
It was the local guide that.
Yeah, I think that all cultures, every sort of tribe thing had a little bit of a thing like that in the past, and they also had it in the past, and they were more gentle, and therefore the Spanish were able, even though the Spanish who arrived in Mexico and these places they were only like 5'2", basically mostly, they were very short. They were so strong, but they were wearing tin suits in hot weather, and they had turista. They had diarrhea, and they were not feeling well, and yet they beat up all these huge people somehow, who were so vicious that they were sacrificing people right and left. Well, it never rang true to me. If they were, you know, in order to have a culture where you're sacrificing human beings, you have to be very rough, because you have to drag these people to their death all the time. That means you have to have super warrior, fierce people to do that. And then a bunch of them Spaniards sitting around, I guess because they had some tin suits and a couple of horses, and they liked to bow down and worship them. I don't think so. That's ridiculous. They were actually more gentle. That's why they were all killed. But anyway, that's another story. Okay, so what do we do about the ovaries? Ovaries are great, You can't get, kicked in the balls in the same way that the men do. It's very lucky. They're protected. So, but I don't know what's the point of that exactly, but it's nice that you expressed it. It's very good. Okay? So, what else? Anything else? We could
do the Heart Sutra. We didn't do the Heart Sutra when we started.
Oh, sure. You want to do more Heart Sutra? Sure. I was going to do more Goddess names, but we could do Heart Sutra. Heart Sutra is good. Maybe I can give you a little more commentary on Heart Sutra too. Sure. We'll go back to that format.
Or we can open tonight with the Heart Sutra.
Yeah, I think that's better.
Okay. All right.
That's better, because this is another old topic.
Okay.
But it's a very important topic because the emptiness thing is so critical. All of these things like the magical side, the compassion side, the miraculous side, even the ability to give the victory to the enemy in a mental way where you don't get pumped up on hatred and frustration, all depends on changing our sense of the background, of the foundation, of where we are located. And if you begin to sort of experiment mentally with feeling like no matter what could possibly happen, everything would be all right, what would that be like? We associate that with saints, people, even in theisms, even father theism. The real saint who feels sort of the oneness with the divine, either through Islam or Judaism or Christianity or the monotheistic forms of Hinduism, which are the ones that we mainly know. When they feel like that, it's like, God willing, inshallah, they're ready. Islam means to surrender, actually. Islam doesn't mean to be a terrorist. Islam means to surrender. Surrender to the will of God, it means. And the idea of God being benevolent and compassionate. So it means surrender to compassion, actually. It's really intriguing. So those people did that. Were capable of doing that. Saintly people were capable of doing that. And the greatness of Asia, and India particularly, and eventually later Tibet and Mongolia and China and other places, Sri Lanka and so on, is that they got more and more into how the basic background is goodness, not evil. So that you don't want to live armed to the teeth, armored to the teeth, and armed to the teeth. You want to be open to discovering the goodness of reality. That's the key thing. And this is something you can be open to.
Okay, I don't want to cover ground that's already been covered, but it was recently suggested to me at work that I, as a woman, should be especially concerned about Muslims and should support a ban on Muslim immigration because Muslims are so hard on women. And I said, well, I haven't been treated badly by any Muslim, be it a man or a woman, and I want to take individuals as I find them, rather than judge an entire group of people based on their traditions.
Good for you.
Okay, thanks. But is this predominant, or is this a particularly persuasive argument at this time? Okay.
No, the ban on the Muslim thing is very stupid. Even George Bush is against it, and Trump didn't do a birther thing about George Bush. I'm sure he would have liked to. George Bush had been, maybe he can prove George Bush was born in Mexico or something, I don't know. But no, it's very stupid because obviously there's 1.5 billion people who are Muslims. If you study the Muslim thing, the Muslims are just trying to be nice Abrahamic followers. They believe in the same God as the Christians do. They believe Jesus was a great master. They don't think Jesus was God. They think that's a little exaggerated on the part of the Christian. But they do think Jesus was every bit a great prophet. And they totally into the Jews, and Jerusalem, and the mountain there where the old temple of David was, and where Jesus threw out the money changers, and where now the dome of the mosque of the dome, or the dome of the rock of the dome, whatever it's called, Al-Aqsa Mosque, is. That's a big thing for the Muslims. So there's really no reason for the Christians have always had a trouble with the Muslims, as they have always had with the Jews. Because, the Jews didn't agree, the rabbinic Jews didn't agree that Christ was the Messiah predicted in the Jewish Bible. And then the Muslims came, and then they rejected that Christ was the last prophet, and they had another prophet. So the Christians have always felt squeezed in between. And actually, if you analyze the long-term record of history, the Christians have been worse than the Muslims. And they're a little lower, they get a little lower grade, actually, even though Jesus taught compassion. And that's because Christian teaching was hijacked by the Roman Empire at some point, by Constantine. He banned the multiple life view that had been the view of the Mediterranean as a whole during Christ's life. He made the crucifix into a big symbol of Christianity, which it had not been for 300 years. They did not worship. They believed in the risen Christ. They did not worship the screwed over Christ, the executed Christ. To them in those days it would have been like wearing an electric chair around your neck. They didn't do that. And the Romans did that because that conveyed a subliminal image of the power of Rome, of course, because the Romans are the ones who put them on there, not the Jews. The Romans did. Then the Romans, however, blamed the Jews for having made Pilate do it, which is false history. He did not. Pilate was a rabid executor. He executed thousands of people. Anybody who thought he might stir up the rabble, he executed. He was actually removed by a later emperor, I forgot the name, than the one who was serving in Rome at the time that he killed Christ. He was removed because he was executing too many people, and it was making them too rested in the colony there, the Jewish colony of Roman Empire. And so the point is that Islam, we have to deal with Islam. It's just something you just have to deal with. And luckily it's connected to, its good side is totally connected to all of the same things that are the good side of the other Abrahamics in Judaism and Christianity. And those things are connected to Buddhism and Hinduism and Confucianism, etc., Taoism. And indigenous, shamanic, non-literary traditions. They're all interconnected. Because, why? Because this is something that the human being, the reality, can try to understand, and it does try to understand. The human being is a being that wants to be realistic about where they're living, because they feel it's maybe not safe not to be realistic. So they have a drive to understand their world. And these people came up with certain things. And the theism basically tries to say that the highest power, it's also trying to say that the highest power in the universe is goodness. But what happens is high priests take a hold of it, and political authorities, and then they try to usurp the role of the good God, the merciful Allah al-Rahim, as the Muslims would say, the compassionate God. They usurp that role, and they say, well, we control whether God is going to be good to you, depending on whether you obey our orders and make offerings to our, congregation plate, the gift plate, whatever it is. And we're not going to let him be good to you if you don't do what we say, which is a perversion, actually, of the original message of the great teachers, including Muhammad. And by the way, Muhammad was a total protectorate of his women. His first wife protected him against all kind of complicated social problems. He was born as an orphan. And then later, once he was, all his teachings were collected by different wives. He had more wives because a lot of his colleagues were killed in the persecutions that they suffered for a long time. And but then he defended himself. So there is the people who do the violent Islam have some kind of bases of texts that they use having to do with the equivalent of Constantine in the Muslim world, the caliphs of Baghdad particularly, and the caliphs of Damascus, who again perverted it a little bit, Muhammad's peace and love message, in order to enforce their authority. And then they hired high priests, jurists, who made them, they gave them a big role, and made, again, usurping the compassion of the deity and saying, well, it's not available if you don't do what we say. So that's a problem not only in Islam, also in Christianity. Look at these people. All the evangelicals in this country, they all voted for a guy who was totally immoral, dishonest, lies. Everyone knew that. Abusive. Completely. They voted for that, supposedly holding their noses. And they all being so moralistic, because they thought they could do some things that they wanted to do and push their authority through the guy. Right? So they all voted for him, in spite of all their moralistic thing about how that guy's so immoral. So, the fanatics of whatever stripe. We have a few Buddhist fanatics. There's a couple in Burma and Sri Lanka nowadays. There's the occasional Buddhist fanatic. And they're really in trouble too. But there's been less of them in history, actually, because they don't have an idea of the ultimate reality. They sort of esoterically come and see the emptiness like the wisdom, transcendent wisdom goddess. So they sort of they tend to go to the female. But actually emptiness itself is not really a person. So when they get up there, they're about to have a battle, and they go, charge for emptiness. It's like, no, the simple-minded troop wants to charge because daddy said so. Or, in a rare case, mommy said so. But the idea that emptiness said so, it's a little harder to appropriate that. So where are you going to go? How are you going to charge for emptiness? So there have been a few less in history because of the idea that the absolute is this, and therefore recognition that the absolute is this relativity means that your absolute preoccupation has to be compassion for others. That's the general tendency, but people understand it imperfectly, and they do stupid things in the name of Buddha too, but not as much, luckily.
Bob, since you're in a little bit of a history mode today,
yes,
it might be interesting to give a history of women in Buddhism.
Of what?
We're kind of in a political arena this afternoon, in a historic arena. And it might be interesting for people to hear the history of women in Buddhism, the history of women's place in Buddhism.
Well, India was also a male chauvinist thing. And basically, it's not really rocket science. Women's lot in societies improved to the degree that militarism declines. It's as easy as that. When the society is highly militaristic and there's a tremendous amount of violence, then generally the males will dominate, and then their PTSD, unrecognized PTSD, will carry over and they'll brutalize their families. So the militaristic Wilhelm Reich, to go to a different non-historical psychologist, have any of you ever heard of Wilhelm Reich? So Wilhelm Reich has a wonderful book called pamphlet, actually. His great book was something called The Function of the Orgasm, in which he comes up with the theory of emotional and physical armoring as being interconnected, trauma and they being interconnected to muscular structures of cutting off internal sensations in the body, cutting off actually the internal health in the body, caused by militarism. At some point in his life he wrote a pamphlet, I think when he was so disillusioned with the Russian Revolution and naturally the Nazi takeover in Germany in the 30s, and he wrote this book called The Emotional Plague and the Murder of Christ. And in that, he talked about how the military posture and the military sort of violence, spanking, beating the children, etc. All of this, beating the women, it all totally interconnects. And it registers in the body of the person conditioned and acculturated in such a militaristic society. So that's the thing. And as I said, Buddhism is blamed by the later Brahmin, even the holy ones nowadays, for making India gentle and demilitarizing India and making them vulnerable. Tibet is blamed by some young Tibetans who are upset that they're being genocided by the Chinese after 60 years of the Dalai Lama trying to stop it. Still going on. And so they blame Buddhism. They say, before that we were power, we had our own army. They naively are thinking only about what happened, where in a way the demilitarized Tibet let the enemy have the victory, in a way. Not necessarily willingly, and there's some people who fought back for some time, although the Dalai Lama never considered that was a good option himself. And he tried to discourage them, but he didn't succeed completely. And then Mongolia. The idea that the Mongolians, who are like everybody's boogeyman, Genghis Khan, they swallowed all of Eurasia, more or less. The biggest empire that Eurasia ever saw. Their land control was bigger than the British Empire, the Mongolian one. Although they didn't do well going to sea like the British did, but they conquered the land. And yet they became peaceful and chewed up in the 20th century because of being demilitarized. And actually nomadic women in general, in nomadic societies, women are very powerful and they're physically powerful. The legend of the Amazons is very much connected to different people, folklorists and historians, they say it's connected to the experience by the Romans and the Greeks, etc., of nomadic women in nomadic societies, because they're basically very strong. They know they deal with yaks and cattle, and the men kind of wander off and go trading for some vegetables, and salt and things, and the women keep those big animals under control, So they're really and actually, anthropologists were wrong. Tibetan women used to have nomadic women had these big headdresses, and then they had all these corals and turquoises and amber and all kinds of things on the headdresses. This jewelry, diamonds and rubies too. And they thought that was their dowry that they brought, But actually it was not a dowry. It was their own bank account. And when they came from their birth family, prosperous ones, normal ones, and most of them were prosperous actually. There was not a lot of poverty in pre-invasion Tibet actually, not a great deal. There were some professional beggars on purpose, who Heinrich Harrer, the German guy, couldn't hire because they lived more prosperous as beggars. They wouldn't work on his irrigation projects, his hydraulic project, but because the Tibetans like to give, so they were living quite well as beggars. But anyway, Chinese ancient chronicles of Han Dynasty refer to the Tibetan women, what they call the Jian tribes, as being very frightening and fearsome. Because agricultural societies tend to be more oppressive of women than the nomadic ones. Because the nomadic, if the guys don't behave, they have their own money, they have the cows, they dish out the milk. The guy can get lost, go find another tent. They're like that a little bit. And so the history of Buddhism with women was that initially the monastic thing, Buddha was mainly concerned to get the men into the monastic movement because the men are the violent ones. That was his reaction. In my Inner Revolution book, I make the argument, and I thought the Catholics would really like it, but they didn't really go for it because they don't like it when you do something and you say we're really working together. They don't want to work together because they want to be exclusive. So they didn't really pick up on it. But basically, I taught the insight that the counter in history to militarism, the professional nonviolent people, are the monastics in general. Sometimes you have monastics being co-opted into some military campaign, like in the Crusades in the West. But basically the monastic thing was where you get men out of the armies. And then they go in and they live very militantly, because that's how they're acculturated. They have rigid discipline, and they meditate a long time, or they chant, and they live very sparsely, and supposedly in very strong discipline, ethical rules. Obedience is a big thing in the Western one, it's not a big thing in the Buddhist one, but still, being self-disciplined is. And so that's taking the military virtues and turning it around where you use it to conquer yourself, rather than conquering other people. So in a way, it's an interaction in the militaristic society, and over 1,500 years, the Indians became much more peaceful. And as they became much more peaceful, you had the equivalent of Masters and Johnson in the 4th century of the Common Era, approximately. About 1600 years before Cleveland or wherever they lived, you know, whatever clinic they had, you know. In other words, criticizing male poor sexuality and lovemaking, actually. You had that in India. Even though they had a lot of monastics and holy people, they also were much more open about pleasure and sexuality as they became less violent. In other words, gradually, they became open about such things. They had their Shakespeare around the same time in their 4th, 5th century. The ragas, the Indian music, the poetics, I mean, their whole civilization became more gentle. Women had a greater role, but it was still male-dominated right to the bitter end. And the Muslims, but being more gentle, they were conquered by the Muslims. So then in the esoteric level in Buddhism, which the last 500 years of Indian Buddhism was very, very predominantly the esoteric, what had been esoteric in the first 1,000 years. So that if you say Buddhism basically in its heyday in India was 1,500 years long, the last 500 years where the esoteric was super important. And the esoteric was where the goddess is very, very prominent. And the Prajnaparamita, actual woman, the idea that a woman can be just as enlightened as a man, which he said right at the beginning, but it was kind of buried by the guys who were mostly the monks, because the monks were the more important. Because the monks were the anti-military military, if you will, the anti-military spiritual militants. And as a social remedy, it made the country more peaceful and made the war less war and so on in India, and tremendous prosperity. You know. Because when the budget of the country doesn't go to support armies, what does it go to? It supports artists, supports families, supports learning, universities. 6,200 monasteries in Tibet when it was invaded. In Cistercian Europe, there was only 1,600 monasteries in the heaviest Christian monasticizing of Europe before the Reformation. And the Reformation, for whatever good it did, also was very bad because, socially for the rest of the world, because it created industrialization and it created a place where the males had no other option than doing something in the world, and therefore they were ready to go and colonize and invade the world. And population growth, Europe exploded with the Reformation, actually, and became much more aggressive around the world. When they before that had, you know, half the men in monasteries, they could have some little local fights between barons and dukes, but they were in no position at all to go conquer the world. So the countries that the Reformation was affected, especially Britain, did a lot of extra conquering. Anyway, so that's the thing. So in the inner teaching of Buddhism, the goddess is very much there, and the yoga of learning to identify yourself with the goddess, which is the essence of the Vajrayana, the Tantrayana, is taught. And a lot of the gurus in the Siddha traditions, the Adept traditions, who were, some of them ex-monks, some of them stayed as monks actually, but their gurus were women sometimes, very often. Mostly they learned from women. And the women could be uneducated, and it could be simple. They'd call them dakinis, you know, some kind of female spirits or something, embodied in human form. They were everywhere, kind of around. But in a way, you never saw the women, even in Tibet, you don't see, the Dalai Lama was never a woman. But there were reincarnate lamas, females, but not as big a number. So it's all been imperfect up until now. Still, none of the Buddhist societies reached a truly partnership society, not yet. But we have a chance now. We do have the chance now. The fifth great renaissance of Buddhism, according to a late professor friend of mine from Japan, who was very, very honored in Japan, gave a lecture in California in his 80s. And those who stayed awake through the lecture had a big shock. And toward the end, it was hard to stay awake because he spoke very slowly, faltering English. But he said, he gave the first four. You know, the original advent of Buddha, then the rise of the Mahayana, the universal vehicle, the non-dualist, the emphasis on the non-dualist side of it. Then he had two things happening in China and Japan because he was frightened about Tantra himself as a Japanese. somehow, he was a Pure Land person personally. He was a little worried about Tantra, which they are. And in China, Japan, East Asia, because of the women thing, actually. China more so than Japan, because the Chinese are more skilled with their women than the Japanese for some reason. And, but he said, the fifth great renaissance in Buddhism, if there is one, will happen in the US. And it will feed back into all the Asian Buddhist societies, and eventually. And this, everybody woke up, all those Zen people, where this center, in summer seminar on the sutras at the Zen Center in Los Angeles. Everyone woke up with a shock. So somehow we're part of the final possible thing. Just as I believe that the planet is ready to reach a really high state soon, peaceful high state, like the Dalai Lama believes that. I also believe that. But in turn, we just took a huge giant step backwards. So they're trying, the boys are trying to take us a giant step backwards. And it all has to do with their fear of women. The whole thing. Get them back in the house, get them back under control. Where is it in Turkey? They're making a new law that you can't go to the police if you're being beaten by your husband. Just different countries are passing rules like that.
Well, that makes it even more important for us to cultivate a relationship with the Great Feminine, right?
Yes.
In this climate, it's very, very important to understand all the different aspects of this power.
Definitely.
And as you're saying, that this wasn't fully comprehended, even with some of the greatest thinkers that have been on the planet, which are the Buddhist philosophers. That this issue is not really completely addressed on a political and economic level.
Definitely.
And
Columbia University, I'm sorry, it's not there. They have all these things about how many people have tenure and whatever. Women are not well represented. Still, they try, but still not. And then it's back in the pipeline. And school goes back to school, in grade school, where the teacher doesn't expect the girls to excel in math, and therefore they don't.
But I think that, this is why it's important for us to divorce in some ways ourselves from the cultural norms and to not allow ourselves as women or as men who seek to be equal with women to be defined by the cultural norms.
I think so.
And that's why establishing this internal relationship with the Great Mother is so important, and to heal our relationship with her is so important, so that we can stand in it no matter what is happening externally.
Right.
And you were talking about being able to die happy no matter how you are dying. And one of the ways that you can achieve that is by healing your relationship with that which is your deepest creative process, and that is inhabited by the Great Mother. And if you are looking at death as a transformation, as a creative process, being aligned with those creative processes as you're dying, independent of anything that's happening around you, or independent of anyone's independent of anyone's ability to try to use a negative intention to break your connection with this deep internal creative process, it's not possible to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think as women, this afternoon is really a discussion of political and historical views of women and women's place in society based on where men's functions and attention is. I think that the lesson from me, I think, is to really step outside of letting anyone or anything outside of yourself define your relationship with your femininity and with your relationship with the Great Mother. And in the class that I teach called Tracking Spirit in the Birth Environment, basically what I'm doing there is I'm trying to help women connect with the Great Mother, so that no matter what is going on, no matter what kind of medical intervention or that may or may not be necessary, or whatever kind of problem that might arise with the child, or a problem that might arise with the actors in the birthing theater, that they have that internal anchor, that internal strength within them through their relationship with the Great Mother to kind of help bring them through it. And I think that this is something that we can all do on a more general level as well. And it doesn't matter what, it doesn't matter how anyone's treating their women. It doesn't matter how anyone's, how they're thinking about their women. If you have your own connection, you don't have to act within those norms. And, especially here in the United States, as many problems as we have right now, women can find an independent way of being here. And survive. In many cultures, women would be exiled if they didn't conform, and they would not survive. But women can survive here, and I think that they, and thrive through this relationship with the Great Mother. So, and with their deeper femininity that she embodies and shows and demonstrates. So, I think that when you're saying that in Buddhism there's this idea that the big change that's going to come in Buddhism is in the West, I do think it is based on bringing women into greater equality within Buddhist structures. And, and I mean, you see, and you see that a lot of places are struggling to find strong women teachers in Buddhist situations. And I think it's our task to become that strong woman, and who understands all of the principles of nonviolence, and all of the has digested all of the lessons on the nature of emptiness and the prajnaparamita and that intense creativity that lies within it, so that we can step into that void and hold it in a way that allows other people to also step into it. And I mean, it's a thought.
I couldn't agree more. I do want to say though that one thing, as far as Buddhism goes, this is maybe an intra-Buddhist thing, but the idea that this Trump business that just happened now, and the number of people who were conned by him, or who he drew in with his misogyny, as one of his major misogyny and xenophobia, and stirring up all kind of resentments and hatred in males, and even in women who identify with their males, and in sort of white whatever. It shows us that there's still a role for the monastic. And like the Zen people go around like, I'm a Zen monk, and they have a girlfriend and a wife, and it's just ridiculous, and the idea that, because the Protestant thing is against monastics, that the culture of conditioning is against monastics, and the Catholic thing is sort of, just it's become kind of politically better known and powerful since the day when Kennedy, people freaked out we couldn't have a Catholic president. And now the Catholics are Supreme Court justices and etc. So they're quite strong in the society. But they themselves are not pushing really very much their monasticism. And we can see that we're still hugely militaristic, $54 billion more dollars to the $600 billion military, and that doesn't even measure the huge expense and the huge focus on militarism. So, those leaders of Buddhism who are all ex-monks, such as myself, they all get into how we don't need monks, our new Buddhism will be no monks, etc. And I think that's not correct. Monks and nuns, and the nun thing should be very like Thupten Chodron and Pema Chodron, the two Chodrons with the two nunneries that they have going in Nova Scotia and in Washington State. They need a lot more support. There should be lots of nunneries so women have a way of not having to be like slave of the family, and see it as a spiritual path and so forth. So this sort of new Buddhist thing might take a little longer than just the next election. But But yet what you're saying, I completely agree with that. And how could that be connected to the movement to try to put together the representation of the people against the wealthy, against the oligarchs? How could this be done? It's very hard to see, actually.
Well, I think if we can return to our own native ways of knowing our own creative power, I think if you have a lot of people that are empowered in this way, I think that change can
Well, yes, I agree.
You know?
But what institution or how are you going to have such a lot of people? That's the question.
We're going to do a lot of teaching.
Yeah, I think that has to happen, yeah.
But Bob,
That
do you
has to
see
happen.
this as a sort of huge...
What's that?
Do you see this as a huge women's movement that's sort of military? What do you see?
Well, no, I think
How do
that,
you
well,
see it?
no.
I mean,
it-
Foxcroft was the perfect
Yes, it should be more military, maybe, I think, you know, but this huge so-called, the fact that the Washington thing happened and was called a women's march, you know, although there were a lot of men marching too. It's good, I think, that's really good. But then the question is how to sustain that, how to connect it to a spiritual thing, you know, how to deal with the evangelicals, for example, which is that 25% group that supported this nasty thing. But basically, there are a lot of them. There are nice evangelicals who, for example, they think it's a sin to destroy God's earth. You know, within their own Christian doctrine, they are. But somehow they're not mobilized. You know, and then there's the abortion issue and the whole thing. And the pro-life, supposedly, although I love the joke where someone said they're pro-life until they've given birth, and then after that you're on your own without insurance.
Or support of any kind.
And you know, so there must be a better way of dealing with these things to remove these wedge issues that are used to remove the spiritual people or the people who have some religious faith from the movement to have a sane, caring society, you know, compassionate and caring society. I mean, you know, I read this Matthew Fox, who I like very much, you know, who is a very nice Catholic, who was condemned by the bad popes that we had recently, like Benedict and other people. But maybe even by John Paul, he was condemned. I forget who was the one who banned him, kind of, Matthew Fox. But he's great. He wrote a letter to Trump, I think, or somebody at some point, and he said, you know, what is it about Jesus saying that you should care for the poor and the oligarch has as much chance of going to heaven as a camel through the eye of a needle? How come you guys are missing those sentences, you know, those passages in your own scriptures? What is your problem that you're blind to them? You know? He puts it very well, Matthew Fox. So how to sustain that great woman's march? You know, I was down with Marianne Williamson with her Sister Giant thing. She had 5,000–6,000 people involved in that, both online and at the event. And it was moving and very strong energy there, no question. And they allowed a few males like me to say something. Come and say something. And the nice Reverend Barber in North Carolina, who is head of the NAACP in North Carolina, has been dealing with those absolute Neanderthals who, you know, were freaked that Roy Cooper won, that Democrat won the governorship finally. And he's trying to function there with his bad legislators that are all put in by the Koch brothers. The dark money created these Republican states that don't even count votes and suppress votes, and which is what another reason that 16 people ran for office. Why did 16 Republicans run for office? Because they knew they did have it rigged. So they knew if they could win the primary, they have a very good chance against whoever, because of the 28 Republican-dominated states. Out of 99 state legislatures, the Republicans control 58. Completely 100% control. Of course, they're strong in others, but they control completely. Yes, I know, we're going to stop now. So now we need to, by your leave, you can stay if you wish. We're going to do an interview. Isa is going to interview and stop a little early, and she's going to interview me about the man of peace over there.
Oh, good.
The Dalai Lama. And we're going to do that, and Justin is going to aim the camera.
We might do that at the beginning of the evening because we only have 5 minutes before, or 10 minutes before dinner served.
No, we're doing
Doing now. We're doing now, so we don't mess up the evening. And it's only 10–15 minutes.
We're doing that.
And we'll go a little late to dinner. People can stay or go, whatever they like. Okay? But we have to move again. The light is no good here, behind it.
It's the best time.
The back light is not good.
Relocate because of the light.
Don't you think?
Is that doable? No?
Light
I
is-
disagree. We can get, if I bring the camera up closer, I can get it really well.
Well, then do it. Let's do it.
All right, I have to go to the bathroom real quick.
Okay.
And we have to dust you off.
This video was brought to you in part with the generous support of the Tibet House U.S. membership community. To learn more about the benefits of Tibet House membership, please visit Tibet House U.S., including invites to special trips to study Buddhism up close and personal with Robert Thurman during his annual geographic expedition trips. Trips in 2018 include Mongolia and Bhutan. To learn more, visit bobthurman.com.